everybody. Hello from Künstlerdorf Schöppingen. My name is Julia Hamann, and this is from the Making Worlds Summer School, which is a collaboration with the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Sustainability of the Universität Münster and the VHS, the local and regional adult education center. This is a summer school based on holistic and relational learning. And also behind the camera is Camilo Pachon, who's a co-curator, and we cannot see him, but he's always here. And I'm really happy to introduce you to Berit Fischer, who is an artist, curator, scholar, writer, and an editor. Her research interests include experimental knowledge information, civic engaging, somatic and listening practices, feminist and ecopedagogies, and critical spatial practices. Her practice often unfolds in forms of affective encounter and relational learning that strives to activate agency and active micropolitics, fields of action and space for critical consciousness raising and engagement. In 2016, she founded the Radical Empathy Lab, an ongoing nomadic research laboratory for socio-ecological knowledge production. She's the curator and founder of the Regaining Ecological Futures curriculum at the Floating University in Berlin and a co-founder of the International Forum of Eco-Embodied Arts. A lot of things. And today, you're talking about micropolitical ecopedagogies. So excited about this. Thank you very much, Berit, for being here. And I'm excited.
Thank you, Julia, for the introduction, and also to Camilo for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here for this week, or the last few days of this week, and to also learn about your practices and get into dialogue and exchange, making worlds together. Today, I would like to share with you I'm not going to talk about curatorial projects of mine as such, but I rather would like to share some fundamental concepts and philosophies that nurture my work as a curator, writer, and artist. Maybe I just give a few words on the structure of my talk. I will share with you some insights on the research that is dear to me, and what I call micropolitical ecopedagogies. And my practice as a curator and as an artist is also informed by this approach. This I position as a post-representational practice, in that it does not strive to display or illustrate ideas and philosophies, but to rather make them experiential. So for me, it's about experiential knowledge production. So you will see a lot of images in the background, impressions of my work, like the Radical Empathy Lab that I founded in 2016 as the practical framework actually of my practice-based PhD, but which since then has been going on as a nomadic, experimental lab for socio-ecological, relational, and experiential knowledge production. And it has been taking place since then in a lot of different contexts. And we're going to have a little session on Friday afternoon, so I hope you can join for that as well. And also you will see images from this festival that Julia mentioned, the Regaining Ecological Futures Festival at Floating University, that I founded and curated since 2021 at this nature culture learning site in Berlin, and I will tell you more about it later. And even though my work has been about post-representational practice, these images, of course, are, again, mere representations. But I guess documentation is a huge challenge for all of us who are dealing or who are doing ephemeral and experiential work, how to document and transfer what was experienced. And I will not go into specific projects that you will see. So the images are really serving to hopefully make the concepts that I'll talk about today a little bit more accessible or more lively and easier to follow, or entertaining even. And yeah, and of course we can talk afterwards maybe about some of the projects, so make notes and we're happy to talk about them afterwards. And now before I start to talk about the theories and philosophies, I'd like to invite you to a brief experience and an awareness exercise. And for that, I would like to invite you, if you feel comfortable, if you don't have to participate, but just to come to the front of your seat maybe and close your eyes for a moment. Maybe also nice after the complex input you have been receiving the last few days and today. And just take a moment to breathe. Just arrive in this space. Take a deep inhale, and you're welcome to do 1 or 2 exhales through the mouth. And really try to sit very straight from your sitting bones. Lift your spine, your neck, as if someone is pulling you up with a string. And for those of you who are on Zoom, you're also invited to join. Relax your jaw, your tongue is relaxed behind your upper teeth. And now observe where your breath is landing in your body. Is it in the nose area, throat area, chest, or maybe even deeper? Become aware of your sitting bones. Observe the weight, how it's balanced. Maybe one side has more weight than the other. Maybe you can observe what your feet and hands are touching, the materialities. Maybe you can observe your heart rate, your heartbeat. Just observe, don't judge. And continue focusing on deep breathing. And while you do so, I would like to invite you to think about a few things I'm going to ask you just for yourselves. Just answer it for yourself. I invite you to think about your socio-political positioning in the world. Very simple thoughts. Don't analyze or think too deeply. In which geopolitical context were you brought up? What is your national identification? The systemic language you speak? Your gender identification? How do you identify personally? And how are you perceived? Are you complying with these categories? How able is your body? What is your economic status? Your educational position in society? What structural benefits or disadvantages do you or your family and ancestors experience? And how does all this influence how you might understand or relate to the subjects that we're engaging in this week? And just listen to what comes up. And maybe you can also refer back to these questions throughout the talk and the rest of the week, maybe. And then whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes again and we can continue. So as mentioned, I'm going to speak about micropolitical ecopedagogies today. So working as an urban practitioner, curator, artist, and scholar, I've been interested in the question of how to activate artistic and curatorial knowledge production and how to mobilize philosophies and theories at stake, that might be at stake. So this question, of course, has been positioned since the early 20th century by rethinking the triangle between the artist, curator, and spectator, by rethinking the relationship between art and its publics and moving towards and activating the publics. Within the concern of curatorial and artistic responsibilities lies for me the crucial question of the agency of the publics and how art realizes its affective and discursive potential, how experience can be shaped and what debates it triggers. How can it realize its discursive potential, how experience can be shaped? Within the arts and humanities, this aspect is often underrepresented and not taken care of enough. Conventionally, in Western culture, informational knowledge production is predominant over a relational and experiential knowledge formation. How can a cultural and artistic practice create conditions and spaces for the publics to be of equal importance in the tripartition of artist, curator, and audience, so that the publics, the audience, become protagonists and become the fundamental subject of the curatorial or artistic care? I argue for an experiential, relational, and emancipating knowledge formation that starts at the micropolitical level. But first, what do I mean by emancipating? To shift the so-called audience away from an onlooking perspective towards not only becoming the player or participant, but also towards becoming a self-active stakeholder in the project, a protagonist and a participant in its etymological connotation of sharing in is the goal. So the conventional notion of the spectator versus protagonist is a rather static approach and needs to be problematized if one understands the curatorial or cultural practice as means for creating agency. Cultural practice is an attempt to contribute on a micropolitical level to the potential of social change by enhancing a relational sensitivity. Today's cognitive capitalism operates on the logic of separationism that demands self-commodification and self-representation, a logic of exteriority, an utterly mediated existence. Equally, omnipresent media consumption, spectatorship, observation, bystanding, and the outside view are qualities that society is abundantly saturated with, and that help the efforts of late cognitive and data capitalists to construct hyper-individualism, separation, binarity, and apathy. Emotional states that manipulate and that can alienate subjects from their own social expressive efforts. And if not handled with a critical eye, it is easily also a fertile ground to nourish post-truth narratives, symbolic violence, populist, right-wing, identitarian, racist, sexist, and nationalist trends. And equally, a ground to blindfold towards exploitative politics and commodification also of the planet. Humanity lives in a precarious planetary and social existence that is governed by the rationale of power-seeking, exploitive, neoliberal, data and cognitive capitalism and global extractivist commodization of life and nature. And more, we're experiencing the delicate vulnerabilities and deeply interwoven interdependencies of humanity with its coexistence, within its coexistence with the planetary community of life. So this dicey and highly charged political climate cries out for a fundamental socio-political and cultural shift that redefines the very nature of relationships with what is considered as other, human and more than human alike, even though more than human is again an anthropocentric perspective. The other, I like to write with an uppercase, with a capital O, to indicate an additional subtext and layer of reflection on the notion of otherness and othering. This is, of course, a massive field of inquiry on its own and not subject of today's talk. I argue for the reorientation towards the relational and interconnectedness, which requires profound ontological and epistemological changes, also in cultural practices, away from neck-up disembodied awareness and critique, and away from practices that merely feed a reactionary passive consumerism and qualities of bystanding observing. Instead, a shift is needed towards a cultural formation of knowledge that can mobilize and activate the theories and issues at stake, and that, as I propose, take a holistic, experiential consciousness raising on the micropolitical level to heart. Such knowledge production welcomes, for example, transdisciplinarity, aesthesis, the Greek notion of aesthesis with sensation, embodiment and situatedness. An epistemology and ethics that calls for a knowing and being with the world, one that expands beyond the close margins of the self, that disrupt limiting binaries and fosters sharing and an openness for pluriversal and polyvocal viewpoints, and an experiential criticality. A holistic attitude that does not separate the mind from the body or emotion from reason. An approach towards an empathic knowledge formation that celebrates heterogeneity and that is reciprocal, intertwined between learning and acting. That by learning acts and by acting learns. A practice towards creating conscientization, towards a critical awareness of being interconnected with all living beings and beyond. It is a search for hybrid alternative epistemological and ontological reimaginations, a transformative pursuit to act and perceive the world otherwise and in fairer ways. So my own practice strives towards the deepening of the relational, trying to deal with contemporary ecological emergencies in a post-representational, micropolitical, and holistic way. And holistic, I not only understand as relating, and actuating both the body and mind, but equally, in the more general sense, as the accentuation of the interrelational and the interconnectedness of systems as whole, and not as divided component parts. This is not understood as a unifying universalist idea, but rather one that emphasizes and embraces heterogeneity. A practice towards the decolonization of the subject, human and the living world alike, and the making of eco-literacy. Decolonization I approach phenomenologically, in the sense of delinking from capitalist appropriations in the process of subjectivation, and to overcome and challenge hierarchical and binary realities of othering and otherness. My work is informed and extended and by an extended interpretation of the idea of conscientization, and most of you know of him, a concept by the Brazilian educator, activist, and educational theorist Paulo Freire from the 1960s and 70s that he laid out, for example, in his book, Education for Critical Consciousness in 74. His life work was based on radical pedagogy and promoted critically conscious, active, non-apathic civilians. Conscientization, creating critical consciousness, is an educative tool to address and experience a reading of the world that tries to bring awareness for not only being in the world, but rather for being with the world, or what Donna Haraway might call a worlding with. Conscientization motivates new levels of critical awareness through experience, communication, and reflection as methods of self-empowerment to shift from being a subaltern object to being a subject with the right to be in resistance and to define one's own reality. Conscientization encourages the ability to get into dialogue with others and with the world, and to replace disengagement with that of full engagement. My approach on conscientization especially values the sensual and experiential. It incorporates what I call a relational versus informational knowledge formation, and that embraces the body, or what Paulo Freire calls the corpo consciente, the knowing body. Scholar Lisa Blackman calls the body as the central metaphor of the political and social order. The body is political, soaked through with social and political tensions. And for me, it's a critical starting point to open pathways for thinking about the relation of micro and macro politics and ecopedagogies. And here I'm very inspired by Brazilian psychoanalyst, curator, writer, and theorist Sueli Rolnik. Her understanding of, oh, I forgot to show you pictures, hold on. Her understanding of micropolitics, for example, in her elaborations on what she calls the colonial capitalist unconsciousness and its politics of desire as the dominant production of subjectivity of Western modernity, which has colonized, not in a geopolitical sense, our consciousness. The dominant capitalist structures continuously gain power at the micropolitical, the minute level of the individual, through mechanisms of fear and manipulation, and of our desires and imaginaries, shaping the preferences, positions, and sensitivities of individual subjects. The mechanisms profit from systems of separation, of creating otherness, by gaining more control and power, decreasing the sensibilities and understanding between opponent views. You turn on the news, you're fed plenty of that. So Rolnik argues that living unconsciously, being disconnected from your knowing body, gives way for destabilization, manipulation, and subjugation. Rolnik argues that an active micropolitics implies a conscious awareness and being in tune with the knowing body. Being aware and understanding our desires, an active micropolitics becomes a place for resistance to counter systemic production of desire, manipulation, and subjugation. So to become aware and regain the authority over our sensual experiences helps us to critically conscious, self-empowered, and enables us to act, to resist, and to disobey. It also means to stay with a question mark, which according to her is the only way for change. And you know that quote also from Donna Haraway. Active micropolitics holds the potential for new configurations of the unconscious and its relation to the world. A resource for breaking from the dominant references, a chance to gain new subjectivity, and for the resistance and liberation from the colonial capitalist unconscious. The concept of active micropolitics is a productive tool for critical thinking about possible and future ways of relating and being together, for fostering self-empowerment, trust, empathic exchange, and sensuality for being with the world and inhabiting this planet. And these are some of the topics that I, for example, also engage in the Radical Empathy Lab. The lab allows me to move between analysis, workshop, experience, and to activate holistic, experiential, and relational forms of knowledge formation. The lab seeks to give space for affective encounter, for rehearsing micropolitical, affective, and holistic knowledge formation, and to stimulate a relational co-learning. In the lab, we intertwine the cognitive with the non-semiotic. Radical is understood in its etymological sense of radix, the root, starting with the root, the self. In the lab sessions, there are elements to practice self-awareness, which then evolve towards engaging into exchange and relational awareness with the other participants, and depending on the context, also the situatedness and environment the lab takes place. For example, Carla Bergman and Nick Montgomery, the authors of the book you saw a picture before, Joyful Militancy, Thriving Resistance in Toxic Times, elaborate on radicalness in the following way. Friendship, kinship, and communalization have also been at the heart of working across the hierarchical divides of heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, colonization, ableism, ecocide, and other systems that have taught us to enact violence on each other and internalize oppressive ways of relating. To make kin across these divisions is a precarious and a radical act. Empathy is less understood as merely altruistic or as an emotional equivalence, but rather understood in the understanding of scholar and theorist Carolyn Padwell. And she pleads for the decolonization of this notion of empathy towards what she calls affective translation. This is the vein of thinking in which I engage with the concept and activate it as a negotiation with the other, human and beyond, by accepting difference and possible foreigners, and to embrace that difference as a potential for dialogue and affective growth. In my artistic and curatorial work and research, I am interested in non-representational, ontological, and epistemological approaches and practices that counter capitalist and hegemonic logics. So, for example, the colonization of our desires and imagination that promotes reactionary anesthesia, an anesthesia and apathy also towards our ecological entanglements with other forms of life. So how can we offer a space for potential micropolitical collective transformation? I propose through ecopedagogical cultural methods for knowledge formation that allows for the transdisciplinary exercises and experiments in which categories of the individual, social, conscious, unconscious, nature, culture, active and passive are tested and might temporarily even become dissolved. Quickly zip through these. And here I'd like to briefly talk about the Floating University, of which I became one of the programmers right after I finished my PhD. And most of you, or some of you probably know, but for those who don't, here's some background info. Floating University is a nature culture learning site in a functioning rainwater retention basin in Berlin that was designed in the 1930s as part of the former Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. Still today, it is a fully functioning infrastructure. It is surrounded by a garden colony, an allotment or community garden, and is therefore almost invisible to passerbys. After the Tempelhof Airport closed down in 2008, the city's redevelopment plan proposed to relocate the basin as a pond situated within the 300 hectares of remaining parkland. This would have transformed 22,500 square meter area of public land occupied by the basin into a valuable, profitable asset for Berlin's real estate portfolio. And I think that is, we know all that. Yeah. However, in the Tempelhof referendum of 2014, Berliners voted against the city and prevented any kind of construction on the airfield. The result of this referendum not only protected the unique inner city green space, but also the basin. The basin plot was closed off to the public for over 60 years. And when Berlin-based architects Raumlabor opened up the site in 2018, they established a temporary urban laboratory for collective learning. Situating a pedagogical experiment in this location was a deliberate form of political engagement. As an association, we host, co-produce, support and welcome activities organized by our programmers and others. But also a diverse range of animals, plants and algae have taken root and given birth to a unique landscape, a man-made environment reclaimed by so-called nature, where polluted water coexists with the relatively new presence of the university. Second. Forming a nature culture or a third landscape. Since 2018, the floating university continues to grow into a site where heterogeneous interests translate into projects, interventions, events, and installations. Becoming the floating university is a constant process of searching, discovering, figuring out, and paying knowledge forward. Since 2018, was such a great success, we founded the Floating e.V., a Verein. We are now a self-organized space and group where practitioners from a wide range of backgrounds meet to collaborate, co-create, and imaginatively work towards futures. We work in working groups and basic democratically, which of course also brings a lot of challenges, as you can imagine, in the becomings of an association. But yeah, I will not go into this right now. By now, we have become internationally quite known and respected, and we won several prizes nationally and internationally, like the Golden Lion at the Venice Architecture Biennial in 2021 for our collaborative, regenerative, and collective work. And this year, actually last year, the European Bauhaus Award for Best Education in the section of Reconnecting with Nature. And we were recently also nominated for the Mies van der Rohe Award, which is still pending. And it is in solidarity with the history of the site and with the lineage of the alternative narratives for urban development that the Floating e.V. situates its mission: to open, maintain, and take care of this unique site while bringing non-disciplinary, radical, and collaborative programs to the public. In other words, it's a place to learn, to engage, to embrace the complexity and navigate the entanglements of the world, to imagine and create different forms of living. So as an active member of the Verein, I, for example, developed collaborations with other members, but I also can experiment and put my own research on micropolitical ecopedagogy into practice. So, for example, I curate this Regaining Ecological Futures Festival, for which you just see the slideshow now. And last year, for example, was the 3rd edition with the focus on mycopoetics, the mycelium, and what we can learn from this omnipresent symbiotic superorganism that is part of our every ecosystem on this planet. And I will show you, I will end my presentation with a short video on that. The festival also as part of the subject of ecopedagogy that starts on the micropolitical level and that strives to activate towards a post-anthropocentric view, a macropolitical awareness for the planetary ecology and the messy entanglements between its coexisting and interdependent beings. The festival critically engages with human-centered ontology and the dualism between nature and culture. It holistically questions how we can change our relation to the natural world towards ecological mindfulness, how to create new syntheses in our technocratic times for a more inclusive cosmological knowing, a knowing with the world. And I like to understand ecology as the entwined relation of all living organisms to one and another, to their physical surroundings. The social and the human organism are included. The human body that itself is a complex, synergetic coexistence of different life forms. Ecology I understand as an interwoven environmental, social, and mental dimension. And I'm also a hopeless optimist. So I believe that even only if on a molecular scale, for example, in our project, that by creating the conditions for and holistically activating a critical awareness of one's interconnectivity and interdependence as a part of this ecology of life, it can support not only to create new imaginaries, but with practice and over time, it might encourage micropolitical decision-making and actions towards embracing, worshipping, and protecting these delicate entanglements, and that it can lead to co-construct care for them on a macropolitical plane. In my practice, I wish to micropolitically and biosensibly activate a relational and entangled internal and external activation of knowledge, one that embraces the multiple dimensions of the planetary interdependent living system through the collective process of practicing of conscious self-knowledge and construction of the self, a transformative process of thinking and learning, of connecting experience with place, might encourage what could be called an intuitive rationality, a biophil rationality that embraces and connects with the community of life on multiple dimensions: cognitive, logical, aesthetic, bodily, emotional, interpersonal, social, spatial, and ecological. So through the construction of shared affective experiences and through a processual learning by doing, that by doing learns, shared meanings can be created. That with practice might bring an ethical sensitization for the interlinked macropolitical, ecological, social, and affective dynamics. I argue that a meaningful knowledge formation is based on the development of personal meaning and aspiration. In the pursuit for micropolitical ecopedagogies, more holistically oriented cultural practices might help to create these aspirations for creating a reality we want to live in. They might to help better understand life experiences, to develop the capacity to feel and intuit, to create and relate. Micropolitical and holistic ecopedagogies may encourage alternative modes of imagining, thinking, and being with the world. A formation of critical consciousness that may carry the potential to extend from the individual to the collective and towards a social transformation and encouragement for eco-literacy, the understanding of the natural systems that sustain life on Earth, the interactions and transactions within and between the biological and ecological systems. To me, micropolitical and holistic makings of ecopedagogies offer essential starting points in the cultural formation of knowledge. towards a planetary consciousness and an embodied planetary citizenship and stewardship. And with this, I would like to thank you so much for your attention. I know it was a lot to take in, and I would like to fade out, and we need some sound, please.
Really, this was really quite an echo. This was really super dense and intense. And I think we're going to process this over time. And I'm also looking forward to the lab session to go like into more practice. But I think it's also like super rich in a lot of content and a lot of definitions and ideas. And it also like I think also totally like resonates with a lot of the things that we have heard and learned about in like the artistic practices and sharings that we've had over the last days. And I actually would like to start with a question that is maybe a bit big or not so easy also, but since we're also reflecting in this week about institutions and also about universities and schools and the adult education center, for example, or other forms of more institutionalized and formal learning, I was wondering if, not asking for a plan, but maybe if you could envision or if there's any ideas at all, maybe how like parts of this practice and this sort of like learning that you've described could also be taken up in these more formal institutions. Is there any possibilities? Do you see anything like this?
Well, I can be invited. Yeah, I mean, this is what I have been suggesting to several universities already. Also, to have a lab session, for example, at the beginning of a semester. I mean, you will get to know. I mean, you can focus in the lab session, for example, on the interpersonal, the social relation, or the ecological. But even just for creating community, it's a very good tool to have a lab session, for example. But yeah, I mean, I don't have the answer to that. I think it needs systemic change. I think it needs. We had a conversation yesterday also about transdisciplinarity. I think, in particular in Germany, I think we need to open up to more hybrid thinking and more transdisciplinary thinking. I think right now Germany is, yeah, it can do more. In other contexts, like in the Anglo-Saxon world, it's much more progressive. I mean, there are even already institutions, universities that are focusing on transdisciplinarity, for example. So yeah, one of the protagonists and participants of one of the festivals once came to me and said, and I think that was the most beautiful compliment I got, you need to find a university dean who invites you. You already have a whole curriculum, So I think it's true. But yeah, we're still stuck in a very hierarchical, patriarchal, also top-down education system. And yeah, I mean, it's a very systemic change is needed in terms of structures, but also thinking.
Yes, thank you. I think this is also a good point about the methods and how to learn, but also the curriculum, what to learn. That's very exciting to go deeper into that too.
Also, I think it starts already with children, I mean, you can start this kind of work in kindergarten or in the first grade already. Mm-hmm. And maybe also talking about institutions, floating university, you saw that is a strike through. We didn't have that at the beginning. And just as an example, we were approached legally that we were not allowed to call ourselves a university because a university is not what we are doing. We're an association. So we had to find a new name, but we chose to strike it through to also open up a reflection on what a university is and also to counter maybe the notion of the university or to offer a different approach towards it.
Thank you so much. I've been following the work of the floating university and yeah, I think it's great that it continues. I mean, I think temporary projects are equally as important as long-term, but it's very hard to keep these things long-term. So congratulations. But yeah, I've always been interested in, it seems a very different position around social practice in the UK that it is in Germany. And I remember back in the day of Berlin, as in my day, not the 80s, the kind of 2000s, where lots of artists from the UK were moving and you'd come to Berlin all the time because flights were like £20 or something. And I had so many artist friends moving to Berlin, but they had more practices that were studio based, and I was still figuring out that I was a social practice artist. And to navigate those spaces, I need systems in place and to be paid within structures of like art organizations. And I'm wondering, has that, because I know we're talking about universities, but in terms of arts education, which is pretty actually quite advanced in the UK, I think maybe in terms of, I just feel like there's a sense of like social practice is like art is here. And if you're social practice, you're kind of put into this social worker position, territory, and that there's a real fine line between that doesn't sit within the realms of like pedagogy, of like education. Is that still the case, or has that shifted at all in the kind of art organizations here? And in terms of like understanding practice more that's outside of a kind of white cube situation?
I wouldn't dare to answer for whole of Germany, or, you know, even because I'm not so involved in the institution.
Maybe Berlin.
Yeah, I can only speak from my perspective, and for this kind of work, I still think the UK is more progressive. I mean, even the Arts Council funding, even during the time when I lived there, which was the early 2000s, when the UK people moved to Berlin, I moved to the UK. So I think there's slow change. It has become more accepted, but to talk about floating, for example, the current situation, we finally, after 2 years of fighting, having legal discussions, we have an LOE, a letter of intent, which means we are temporarily allowed to stay. But guess what? Now we don't get any funding anymore. So we don't have any funding this year. Yeah.
Where did the funding come from?
Well, we always finance ourselves through programs. So we have to write the funding applications through program. Sometimes we get very small basic funding, but basically it comes from the program, and then, you know, we give a certain percentage to the organization so that it can be run and maintained and side care, etc. Yeah,
like
but
private foundations or
it's association, it's a Verein, so it's self-organized.
Okay.
We don't have any structural funding or anything. And this year we didn't even get program funding. So the festival, for example, is also off this year. But I think that is a general dilemma, probably not also in Germany, because I think heteropatriarchic values are booming, and money, funds are being shifted towards, what was it? Achille Membe talks about necropolitics, so to create death zones, also for manipulation and control and separation. So I think that's the tendency right now, necropolitics, and not culture and art anymore, and social work.
Thank you. There is another question from the chat to just like read aloud. So Nikolaus is asking, saying thank you very much. And one question, what is your role in the processes you want to initiate? How much can you hold back? To what extent do you need to set things in motion?
Not sure if I understand the last part, but there more.
What is your role in the process you want to initiate?
Mm-hmm.
How much can you hold back? To what extent do you need to set things in motion? Maybe he's
setting things in
like,
motion.
What are you building on, and what are you facilitating, and maybe also like what's the network and alliance that you do the work you're doing. Maybe it's also reference to what spaces are involved in these processes already, or what agencies?
Well, I mean, it depends. The role depends if I'm in the curator position, where I invite fellows and peers to help me activate the ideas. So then I operate as a curator, like the role of the curator, the caretaker, the hospitality. I create the concept. I'm in dialogue. I commission practices. I'm in close dialogue with the artists, and sometimes we develop something new. And if I'm holding sessions myself, so that is more my artistic practice, like with the Radical Empathy Lab, for example, then I am the initiator of the exercises that I prepare and sort of choreograph, for lack of a better word, that my offerings of practices and exercises that I either enact, like, for example, Pauline Oliveros, deep listening exercises, and she's very generous in sharing scores on that, for example. But I also have developed practices on my own. I also come from yogic philosophy and practice. I'm a practitioner and also share the knowledge. And for me, it's a philosophical system, obviously, which is exactly what I've been talking about, because the ultimate is exactly that, to create a critical awareness for your entanglement with the world, and through a critical self-reflection. So for me, yogic practice is also a socio-political practice, actually. Yeah, so I'm very active when I lead a workshop, obviously. So I don't know if this is answering the question.
Yes, thank you. I think if also I understood and the question correctly, but also like from what you just said, I think it's quite interesting how the roles are also like interchanging in thinking about also like systems and structures, and how you're like in between the positions within these spaces, because maybe also because because it's also about like changing some structures and like not having anyone on this like institutional side yet who could like pick up these practices, but so like you need to go into that also.
Thank you for all. And I have a related question to that. How do you set your goals for your exercises? It's a very pedagogical question, and I think the goals are always also the process. So, as you said, that you work with exercises from Pauline Oliveros, and also create own exercises, and I want to hear more about that.
That's always a question I get. So, but what are you doing in the Radical Empathy Lab? And I say, well, join one, because, you know, it's about experience. So it's a bit difficult. I don't want to put it into language, because language cannot translate the experience, and the experience is very different for each individual. So also goals is not a word that I would use. Of course, when I prepare for a session, I try to understand the context where the session is taking place. I try to understand also the physical context where it's taking place. And then I try to focus and emphasize towards that. So if it is about social interaction or activation, then I try to select exercises, that go towards that direction. Or if possible, maybe also with the situatedness of the place, and ideally also outside. so that we can also try to heighten our sensitivity to the natural world, or the urban natural world, or however we want to call it. Yeah, so it's really more about the setting. It's not my goal, what I'm trying to impose, but rather I usually prepare several exercises, and then it's a very intuitive process as well. And I try to sense what is needed. So even if I prepared something, it might be something completely different in the end. So it's a very, like a Pauline Oliveros, listening deeply and trying to get into tune, and a lot of sensing also from my side. Yeah.
Hi, Berit. Thank you so much. I wanted if you could expand the affective translation more, because I was interested about how much like kind of translation exists, how many or what kind. Maybe you work with another kind of translation affective methods. So if you like, and also since you mentioned the mycelio, correct me if I'm wrong, if you are using psilocybin therapy too.
I don't, yeah. I would have liked to, but I think that's very complicated if you use public money. You know,
Sure.
yeah, so I haven't used it in the project. But of
Or
course,
maybe conceptualize the
yeah,
using of psilocybin to, I don't know, create.
yeah. I did
community.
not, it was not part of this festival, but of course,
Okay.
it is also talking about transdisciplinarity. Of course, I highly respect the science also behind it, and you know, the usage of it, which finally has revived, which was shut down, I think, in the 60s or 70s, and now is experiencing a revival. In terms of affective translation, so this is a term by Carolyn Padwell, and you know, it refers to empathy, or I like to, yeah, because empathy is often understood as an altruistic notion, like a very superficial idea of empathy means I put myself into your shoes and then I understand what your problem is and I can be compassionate with you. And I think it's not that easy. I can't put myself into your shoes because you have your own personal history, your cultural history. You know, you bring whatever you bring to the conversation, and I bring all my cultural, personal, etc. history. So it can only be an approximation. So I can't possibly understand or sense or be affected by the full spectrum of when I'm trying to be empathetic with you. So I can only approximate and I can only approach it. And so I think this is really important because if you think of empathy in this more common sense, this altruistic sense, I put myself into your shoes, it is actually, again, a very hierarchical position because you put yourself above who or whatever is to be empathized. So it kind of reiterates a hierarchical structure. And if you think of empathy more like an affective encounter and a translation, then it is much more on eye height and respecting difference, and diversity and heterogeneity, and actually celebrating that, respecting that gap, you know, because in translation, I think there's always a gap. And you can have good translators and bad translators. I mean, if you think of regular translation, not talking about empathy. So it's always, for me, and I speak a few languages myself, so I know the complexity that you sometimes can say things in one language much better than in another language. And to translate that is sometimes really difficult and creates a gap in between, you know, which you can't fill. So I think this is how it works with empathy as well, and affectivity. So you can only come that close, but you can't merge fully. Even with someone you fully love, or even with your family, or someone or some being that is super close to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it was very nourishing to follow your spirit and your power in all these topics and the passion. It was very inspiring. And what I also perceive is that there is a huge wish also for this transformation in the society. And my question is, like, as we know, is like for making change and to transform something, you have also, or you need kind of an open system. And my question is how you perceive, especially as you work in Germany or in Berlin, how open you really, really perceive the people, if they're ready to change and make a transformation, or if they just pretend to be open. I don't know if my question is clear.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe to add, because I can imagine that there's also a lot of anxiety of change in our country, specifically in Germany, of change. But maybe it's different.
It's interesting because I was thinking this morning also about in what cultural context I have given a lab, for example, and the word anxiety also came up when I was giving a session in Romania, for example, because this kind of work is really not very established in the Romanian context, apparently. I don't know, I was only there for 10 days. But that was the feedback from the protagonists. And I gave a lab session the other day for the first time, actually, even though my PhD was done in the UK at Winchester School of Art. I gave a lab in London, and it was the people participated. They were completely open. They were like laughing, screaming. It was insane. It was stunning, totally stunning. And yeah, I've been wondering, and I would be super curious to give it in even more different cultural contexts to see. And also, I also am learning each time, obviously, even also if I give sessions in Germany. So yeah, just to maybe mellow your idea about Germany, I don't think it's only a German issue. But yeah, transformation. I mean, I think the people, and that is, I think, a critique point also, which I usually also get in Q&As. But you stay kind of within the art or cultural bubble, which is totally correct. And I would love to break that and to also work in different contexts. But, you know, we are all only humans. So my network is a cultural network. But I would love to do this kind of work also in a with a non-informed audience, because usually the people who join are already somewhat informed or want to be more informed or want to learn about something. So it's already kind of a little bit elitist, if I may say. So that's the downside of it. So these people who have joined are very open for transformation. And I have to say, I was sometimes not even aware, and especially at the beginning when I started doing this kind of work, giving workshops myself, how deep this could go. I mean, you know, when it hits something really deep in someone. So I learned over the years, I've been doing it for 8 years, to also bring it back to philosophies, like, to bring back a structure so that it doesn't become a completely psychological or something moment. But I'm getting carried away. Hold on. The transformation. So yeah, for example, I once got a feedback from someone. So it was, you saw the pictures, we were working with soil. And I got a feedback from someone, and she told me she was so grateful that to think about soil in a different way, because she was a Ukrainian refugee, and to have a different engagement with soil. And I mean, we were creating biodiversity, so it was a very affirmative, constructive session we were doing. And I hope, or I try to offer affirmative exercises, because I think we live in a world where we are all overwhelmed. I mean, we all know when we turn on the news, in general, this information overflow, this hyper semio cognitive capitalism we are all victims of. Yeah, we kind of lose our capacity also to our agency in a way, because we get numb. I mean, no wonder. I mean, it's way too much. All the negative details, dying or extinguished species, the climate catastrophe, the wars, etc., etc. So you asked me about the big transformations. I think the big transformations do need systemic change, but if we don't start with the self, how can we even slightly approach systemic change? So maybe it's more like in a hippie movement or so, we have to become more. We have to spread with the word. We have to spread the practice, and we have to stick together. We have to create conditions like Julia and Camillo are doing here, to create situations where we can also gather and nourish ourselves to gain strength again, because I mean, we all have our anxieties and sometimes feel like, oh, maybe we just give up, but so there are so many levels. So I think on the cultural system, it needs more. It always needs more. And yeah, but I think if you work on this really micro level of the individual self, at least you have the feeling that you have some agency, that you yourself can change something, And I think that in our, really times of despair is a glimpse of hope, maybe. I don't know. So I'm trying to give glimpses of hope. Yeah, I don't know if it answers, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Berit. It was very inspiring talk. Did you ever work with natural scientists? Because you work with fungi, you work with soils. Did you make this experience?
I did in the soil experiment you saw. I worked with a biochemist, a soil specialist. So I had invited her for the first festival, for example, and I really enjoyed her practice. And then I thought there's something to it. Can we maybe merge or try as an experiment to work transdisciplinary? And so this was the session Flourishing Biodiversity, where we developed together a workshop over 2 days, where we were building a hot compost, creating the conditions for soil beings to have a party, basically, and to replicate themselves. And through that, you create the heat in the compost pile. And I tried to, it became a little bit ritualistic, or, to also think about body and movement in the creation of the compost, for example. So we both were very happy about how this experiment worked, and the people who participated, even weeks later, we got really positive feedback, and we would love to do it again, but we haven't had the setting for it yet. And then, of course, in the Micropoetics Festival, for example, I had invited Vera Meyer. She's a microbiologist from the TU, and she's also a really amazing person. She's a visionary. She wants, by 2030, to have houses built from mycelial material, and she has built a small house already and tested it in terms of insulation, etc. So she was giving a really inspiring lecture as well. Who else? Yeah, but I would love to work more as a curator, but also as an artistic. I would love to engage in dialogue with the scientists and work maybe over a longer period of time also with someone to develop, you know, a format that can translate science to the civic society as well, and engage civic society so that science can also become a social practice. So I really would love that, but yeah, I haven't had many opportunities yet. Yeah. Was that answer? Do you had another?
It was another answer, but it was very fine. Also, no, it was very good. Thank you very much. But I thought, as your, how can I say, your pupils, the people who participate in the workshop, but because scientists sometimes see then when they work with soil and they work with micelles, they would know very good what happens there. They would not be surprised that soil is alive. And then I'm trying in my thoughts to fill this gap of knowing that the soil breathes and be affected by the breath of the soil. And that is the step I think you can do with your work. Yeah, and I was trying to imagine how this step can be.
Well, that's what we tried in this 2-day experiment. So we tried to create an affective translation to it. So maybe you remember the image where we lift the hot compost, for example. So yes, I mean, first I have to say the participants, protagonists were not scientists. So for them, it probably, you know, it was new knowledge or more refined knowledge maybe to engage with that, but also to engage with it in this particular way. So Martina, the biochemist, for example, she has done these workshops and just teaching how to do the compost, and then, you know, how to use it effectively. After 3 months, it's ready soil to be used in the garden. So she has worked a lot in gardens. And so in our collaboration, we really try to bring it onto a more philosophical level, but also to encounter these beings, because at the beginning, you don't even need, I mean, we also had microscopes, etc. But at the beginning, I mean, you see the earthworms, they are the giant soil beings. And of course, they get micro. But just to have that moment, and just to also have, and that's the beauty of hot compost, you have to build it in a certain size. It's really the size kind of a human being, like 150 at least, and also width, and it has to have a certain height. And so it really looks like a being on the ground that is covered with, I don't know, wool or something. And when you can touch this being, this giant thing, and it is 60 degrees hot. So it is like a body temperature. So along that, you know, but to really not in a mechanical, technological way, you of course can say, oh yeah, okay, it's ready. Okay, now we can use it for, but to kind of also honor it and celebrate it and kind of create a ritual around it. That makes a difference, you know, how you approach. So I think it's the approach, how we deal with the natural world or with each other even, that makes the difference.
Yes, because in sustainability research, we say that there is a gap. We are in science, we are offering data, but we are not offering the way to relate with this data. Exactly. And so I was thinking if scientists would learn themselves to relate affective with the data they are generating, they would communicate them other way with other quality and then other quality of communication.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm trying to, this translational process. Yeah. And then maybe it also would have more effect on society impact, you know, for the macropolitical change, the transformation. I think it would be super necessary, actually. Before, I mean, it's maybe already too late, but maybe not.
It's never too late.
Exactly. Yeah, are there more questions also from the chat maybe, or? Okay.
Still processing, I guess. Yes. But yes, then thank you again, Berit, so much. Yeah.
Thank you.